That way.
Okay. Well, let's see who shows up. Who shows up. Yeah. Is there?
Ron's in here. Hello, Ron.
Who is it?
Ron Gonzalez. He's one of our newest agents.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, what's the name again?
Ron.
Ron.
Yeah.
Hey, Ron, welcome to the class.
Hi, Kent. How you
How are you
doing?
this morning?
Doing very well.
Can we hear? Is it
Can you
coming
hear
by
me?
these mornings?
The volume?
We in?
Yeah.
Ron, will
Can you
try
hear
and
me?
Say something now.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We're getting there.
How you doing this morning, Kent? Thanks for
Good, how are
doing
you?
this.
Good. Yeah, we had the volume down. Thank you, Lauren.
Of course.
So, tell me a little bit about yourself. So you're the only one that's in the room, so far. So I want to make sure that I customize this based on your experience level and all of that.
Oh, great. So I'm new in the industry. I think we met a couple weeks ago. I was finishing my master's degree in real estate development. I finished. I got licensed. Well, I passed the exam this past Monday, and I'm waiting for the background check to come back.
Yeah.
And I'm just eager to start my business, within sales and getting to build my pipeline and so forth, and of course understanding better all the contracts and how to deal correctly with my clients in their best interest.
Good, good. I like that. And being the compliance broker, obviously my bailiwick is contracts. And so I'm kind of your contract guy if you have problems or questions about your contracts. And so that's perfect. So where did you go to school for your real estate degree?
I went to the U, so
Oh.
that was part of the David Eccles School of Business, just like an MBA with the focus of real estate development.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's the highest degree you can get in real estate. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been a journey.
How long did that take you to get that degree?
Well, I expedited the process. So it took me 9 months,
Okay.
3 semesters to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty quick. You really dedicated yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. And I have a background in code compliance. I was a building inspector, combined inspector for multiple jurisdictions across the state. So I I get the feeling of the compliance portion of things, although this is different. There's more legal intent
Boy,
involved.
you're a broker's dream. Being having an MBA in real estate and a compliance guy. I mean that's awesome. That's great. It doesn't do a lot for Sean and my job security because you'll never have a problem. But it's good that you won't be getting into trouble because your nature is to avoid those issues. So that's great.
That would be my goal for sure.
Yeah.
That is my goal. Yeah.
Well, hey, as we go along here, this is really informal. Depending on who ends up joining us, if anybody, this really kind of ends up being a mastermind because we're only 4 weeks into this change with us having to change the way that we talk about compensation and the forms. And so all of us are still figuring it out. Sean and I attend a weekly mastermind with all of the other brokers, with KW in the state of Utah, and we share information and situations and problems. And so we think we have a pretty good idea. I also look at all the paperwork that comes to the office so I can kind of see what agents are doing or not doing as far as how they're dealing with identifying compensation. As you know, it was on the MLS till the middle of last month. And so for the last 4 weeks, compensation has not been on the MLS. So we've had to find other ways of communicating compensation to each other, which to me is really a great thing because what it means is that we're talking to each other. We're talking, we're texting, hopefully talking. I know there's a lot of texting that goes on in the industry. But that's how we have to do it. Before you wouldn't even have to talk to the listing agent on a transaction. You knew exactly what they're going to pay. You scheduled your visits to the property through the showing service. You send over an offer, boom, you know. So this is requiring us to talk to each other early on in the process and hopefully try to structure deals that work for everybody. So that's kind of what we're hoping for. So the first thing that I want to cover is the change to the real estate purchase contract. So up until 4 weeks ago, you could not put compensation in the real estate purchase contract unless you did it very specifically through an addendum that was written by the UAR that said seller to pay buyer's brokerage commission. And you could use that single document where the buyer would ask the seller to pay their commission through an addendum in the REPC. And that's how that was done. How you doing?
Is me.
Good. So that's kind of how that happened before, was that's the only way that you could address compensation was by using that one addendum. Otherwise, it was an ethics violation. Say, for example, if you were to say, in a REPC, without using that addendum, if you were to say, seller to pay 3% commission to buyer's broker, that was an ethics violation. Because that's the agent asking the seller to pay the commission. Because the REPC is between what parties?
The REPC in between was the real estate purchase contract. So that would be in between the buyer.
Yep.
And the representation party.
The seller.
Oh, so buyer and seller there, okay.
Yeah, so the brokerages are not part of the REPC.
Okay.
It's strictly between the buyer and seller. So that's why when you would add language from the broker saying, hey, I want you to pay my commission, you're not part of that transaction. You're an ancillary part of the transaction. That's why it became an ethics violation, is because it's between the two principals. It's between the seller and the buyer. Other than using that one addendum. Now, the commission is in the REPC. So they added section 4.3 to the REPC. So here it talks, and 4.3 is the section of the REPC where it talks about fees and costs. So it talks about escrow fees, talks about rental deposits. Then it gets into HOA fees. Who's going to pay the HOA fees in the transaction? And so you can designate, is it the buyer, the seller, or a combination of both of those? Who pays the utilities? So it says buyer agrees they'll be responsible for the utilities to the property after the settlement deadline. Then it goes down into E, which talks about seller contribution to buyer's brokerage. And so this is added. Everything that's yellow in these documents is new verbiage in the documents. So this is now part of the REPC. So from my experience in the last 4 weeks, this is the most common way that a buyer's agent is asking the seller to pay their commission. Actually, the buyer's asking the seller to pay their commission in this section 4.3, because it says seller contribution to buyer's brokerage. Seller and buyer agree that seller shall contribute blank percentage to the purchase price of the buyer's brokerage or blank dollars to the buyer's brokerage. So you can either specify a percentage or you can specify a flat fee to be paid by the seller. If applicable, this payment shall be made in addition. Now this is very important. This is tripping agents up, and we're getting into a double commission obligation situation, because this language says this payment is into addition to any other compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage. If box is checked, then the seller has not agreed to compensate buyer's brokerage in the REPC. Buyer and seller mutually agree that the buyer's brokerage is a third party beneficiary to the REPC, just like I said. We as brokerages, we're a third party. We're not part of the REPC. That's between the buyer and the seller. Then it says that only buyer agrees that seller's payment to buyer's brokerage does not exceed the amount between the buyer and the buyer's brokerage. So the buyer is attesting in this paragraph that the amount listed above is not more than what's in the buyer broker agreement. So it's illegal for us to be paid more than what's in our buyer broker agreement. So let's say, for example, that you're the buyer's agent, I'm the buyer. In our buyer broker agreement between the two of us, I've agreed to pay you 2% commission. And that's what the buyer broker agreement basically says is, hey, the buyer's going to pay you your commission, but we're still looking to the seller to either pay that commission or help us pay that commission. So the buyer broker agreement is the governing document. So even if this said 3% of the purchase price, but my buyer broker agreement with you said 2%, that's all I can receive is 2%. That other percent goes away at closing. You can't receive more than what's in your buyer broker agreement. So my recommendation to you is that every time you sign a buyer broker agreement, put it for the maximum compensation that you want to be compensated. If your business plan says that you're a 3% agent or a 4% agent, then put 3% or 4% every time. And you say, well, Ken, what if the seller and the buyer are not willing to pay the 4%? You can always modify your agreement down, but you can't modify your agreement up. So in other words, you can't go from 2 to 3.
It's capped.
Yep. Whatever the original amount is, and the DOJ was very specific on that, that you cannot go up, but you can go down. Now you can't. Now, having said that, you can go up if you can justify the additional compensation. So, for example, let's say that you had a 2% buyer broker agreement, and once you go under contract on the property, you and the buyer realize that this is going to be much more work than what you thought it was going to be because of the kind of property that it is, or the tests and evaluations on the property. Let's say that you're going to do a home inspection, you're going to do lead, you're going to do radon. You're concerned that maybe there was some dumping on the property, and you're going to test for environmental conditions. Or let's say that the property is a short sale or a bank-owned property, and those are not easy to do. Those take an extended length of time because you've got a third party involved in the transaction, the bank. And so you're going to spend probably 2 or 3 times more working on that transaction than you are on just a typical sale where a bank is not involved. And so if you can justify the additional compensation, you can raise your buyer broker agreement to a higher compensation. Does that make sense? But it's got to be done with agreement with the buyer. And in my opinion, those circumstances are rare.
Extraordinary, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not something that you would do as a normal course of business. So there is an exception to what I just said, and that's if the transaction ends up being much more complicated than what you originally thought it was. And so because of that, there's additional compensation needed. Okay. The provisions of this section will survive closing. So the reason why we have that in there is because if there ends up being a commission dispute and we need to go to court, we want that section to survive closing so that when we go to court, whatever the judge determines will dictate. Okay. All right. So that's the REPC. So that's how we address that in the REPC. So back to this in addition language. And the reason why I want to point that out is if we go to the other document that was created by the state is this document right here. So this document is a brand new document. It's called a compensation agreement. And so the way that the state proposed using this document is that, let's say I'm the listing agent and you're the buyer's agent. You have a buyer that's interested in my listing. And you call me up and you say, hey, Ken, I'm interested in your listing. My buyer is, we looked at the property and my buyer wants to write an offer. We're that interested that they're telling me they want to write an offer. What compensation are you offering? What compensation is the seller offering with this particular property? Then I say to you, hey, what's your email? I'm going to send you over our compensation agreement. And it's in there. He's paying up to 2%. So the listing agent would fill out this document with 2%. They would have the seller sign it right here. So the seller signs it here, the buyer signs it here, buyer's agent signs it here, and the selling agent signs it there. So this is signed by all four parties. So this is a legally binding document because it's executed by everybody. So this document says that they're going to offer you 2%. Okay, that's what the seller's offering. So we have this legally binding document called the compensation agreement for 2%. Then you go to the REPC and you fill out the REPC. And in section 4.3, you put 2% here. That the seller's going to pay you 2%. And so how much are you asking the seller to pay?
2%.
4%.
4%.
Yeah, because they compound. The compensation agreement is a legally binding agreement.
Yeah,
for
buyer will
2%.
come up with a 2, and then the seller agree to 2.
No, the seller's in this case, the seller is agreeing to pay 2% twice. So here in the REPC, it says 2%. So if you put 2% here on this document, it says in addition to any other compensation. So you put 2% there, and then the listing agent sends you over this document here, the compensation agreement that's signed by all parties, saying the seller's going to pay 2% because it says compensation from seller's brokerage. This agreement is between the seller's brokerage and buyer's brokerage and is authorized at closing to disperse payment of compensation directly to the buyer's brokerage as follows: 2% of gross of the acquisition price. Okay. Seller has signed it, buyer has signed it, both agents have signed it. This is a legally binding contract. Okay. Then you put it in the REPC for 2%, and the seller accepts that. That's 4% now that he's obligated to pay. So just be careful both on the listing side and the buyer side.
What's the intent?
Don't use both. Don't use both. Use one or the other. If you have a compensation agreement that's signed by both parties and fully executed, that's good enough. So in section 4.3 of the REPC, you would just leave that blank.
Okay.
Okay. My preference for you, so the best practice, in my opinion, what I'm seeing is I'm seeing agents move away from this. This was how the state wanted us to do it. They were instructing us 4 weeks ago, hey, you guys as listing agents, the first thing you need to do is get your listing agreement signed, get the ERS signed. And the second thing you need to do is get this signed by your seller so that everybody knows what compensation is being offered. Then you send that via email to everybody that's interested in the property. That sounds all well and fine. That sounds great. But the problem is then after that, then they approved the language in the REPC. So this came after after the compensation agreement, whoops. This came after the compensation agreement and was put in the REPSI. So now we have two mechanisms in order to define compensation, but they're compounding. So you don't need both. If you're going to put your compensation in the REPSI, that's the only place you need to put your compensation. If you have a signed compensation agreement, then leave this blank. That makes sense. And as a listing agent, you want to make sure that the buyer's agent doesn't do both, because then your seller is obligated to pay 2 commissions. Any questions on
And
that?
overall, the preference, it doesn't matter, any of the two
Yeah.
can be signed,
But not both.
but not both.
Yeah.
Good.
What I'm seeing is I'm seeing agents skip the compensation agreement and not use that. They're just addressing the compensation in the REPSI in section 4.3.
Hmm.
That's what I'm seeing more of.
Keep it more compact.
Yeah, I mean, we have to fill out the REPSI anyway. So let's just put it in the REPSI. Why create another document that we have to keep track of? And we have to share with the lender and title and all that. So to me, it just streamlines the process. So, and it came out first. So that's why once we put it in the REPSI, to me, that other form is not needed. Any more questions on that?
No.
Yeah, so here's the buyer broker agreement, and everything highlighted on this form is new verbiage in this agreement. So let's kind of go through this and explain what they changed and why. So the first thing that is different on this agreement, and is very important, is that the first item here is the date. So this is the expiration date. So the contract ends on this date. Very important for those of us that have been in the business. That originally was the start date in the contract. So if you put today's date, like you would normally,
Oh, and
it ends at 5 o'clock today. So for those of us that have filled out a lot of buyer broker agreements, that's 180 degrees different than the way it was, because that's now the end date, not the start date. The start date is the day that you sign it on the last page. That's the effective date. So that's very important to point out. And then they added section 1.2, which talks about locations. So the old buyer broker agreement had the first one there that says that this agreement covers properties only within these counties. Okay, so the old agreement, you could identify an address, specific address in a county, or you could just say it's good for Davis, Weber, and Salt Lake counties. So if your buyer's not quite sure where they are going to ultimately end up, you can add multiple counties. Some people will put entire state of Utah.
it's too much.
That's too broad. If you were to go to court or to go to arbitration to try to seek
Not gonna serve you well.
yeah, it's too broad. And then also, my opinion is that some agents will make these agreements for 1 year. I think that's too long, personally. I think if you go to court, that doesn't serve you well either. The judge is going to say, really? You're obligating these people for an entire year? Most commonly, I see 6 months, 3 to 6 months on the agreement. The agreement can always be renewed. And if you're under contract and the agreement expires, doesn't matter. You're still protected. So, you know, to me, it doesn't make sense to try to obligate somebody for a long period of time, because if you did end up having to go to court or arbitration, it's not going to serve you well.
The binding on a leasing contract expiration, it's a little bit different, right? That's regulated. It's
No.
90 days?
No,
Okay.
they're all, the commissions and the length are not regulated in any way on either document. It's totally negotiated between you and your client. Like I said, some agents sign them for a year. I sign mine for 90 days because I'm confident enough in my business that I know that I'm gonna find them a property or sell their property within 90 days. And if I don't, I'm also confident enough in my business to know that they'll re-up with me. I don't worry about losing them because I will make sure that they're happy. So that's kind of how I do it. Most commonly 6 months on both of these agreements, on the buyer broker and the exclusive right to sell. So on this one, you can make it based on a county or, but not in addition to, you can make it located specifically on an address. I met a buyer last night at one of my listings that didn't want to sign a broad buyer broker agreement. He only wanted it for that particular property. So I did. I just put the address of that property. You can make the length of time on this agreement whatever you want. You can make it for the day, a week, a month, several months. Me personally, it doesn't make sense to do it for a short period of time because it's of no value. But sometimes buyers are really hesitant about signing agreements like this. So that's just all negotiable between you and the client. It would be better to sign it for a short period of time than it would be not to sign it and not show them the property, in my opinion. Because hopefully if you show them the property and you start to work with them, they're going to like you and all those fears are going to go away. But if you don't have an opportunity to work with them,
Show the value.
yeah, show your value. So you make it for one of the two. And then this was added here. And this is great because it says, unless checked below, buyer warrants that buyer has not entered into a representation agreement with another brokerage and has no obligation to pay compensation to another company arising out of the acquisition of property. This is before we didn't have this. So we would have to ask, we would have to ask the buyer, hey, are you working with anybody? Have you signed an agreement? This has them state as a fact that they have not. Now, if they have, then you have to have a conversation about what is the length and what is the territory of the other buyer broker agreement you signed. And I don't believe people. So if they've signed another buyer broker agreement, I want to see it. I want a copy of it. And then that way we can figure out, hey, has it expired? Is it only good for one address? Is it good for a county that we're not going to look at?
It's like the due diligence to not work for free.
Yeah, exactly.
Good, okay.
Yep. So if they check the box, it says buyer does have representation with another brokerage for the following properties. And so then that is listed. You list the addresses of those properties or the counties. Then that way you can steer clear of those properties and avoid any conflict. Okay. Then down here in section 2, they added the language that the buyer agrees to pay the company the brokerage fee and its gross acquisition price of the property. Before, we could select either net or gross. For a buyer's agent, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. I guess it does. I guess it's the same. But all of these documents are now written gross. So if your client only wanted to pay on the net sales price, so the difference between gross and net is that, let's say, for example, you have a buyer, the buyer went under contract on a property at $350, but the seller is paying $15,000 towards their closing costs. If your contract says net, then you're only going to get paid on $335. So the concessions come out of the purchase price for a net purchase price. If it's gross, like these are written, then you would get paid on the $350. So it usually doesn't make a huge difference. It's a few $100s, the difference between $335 and $350. What is that? $450, something like that. But sometimes it's the principle of the thing. I personally, in the past, have made all my listing agreements net. Because I didn't want my seller to have to pay my commission or the buyer's agent commission on their concessions. It's bad enough that they're having to pay the $15,000 to the buyer, but then add another $1,000 worth of commission on that 15,000. Now they're paying 16,000. You know, but all of these agreements have now gone to gross. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It also has the language in there in 2.2 that says that the compensation has to match what's in the buyer broker agreement. There again, you know, you can't get paid more than what's in the buyer broker agreement. Section 2.3 is just a reinforcement of the fact that brokerage fees are fully negotiable and are not set by law by a board of realtor or an association of realtor or the MLS or in any manner other than between the company and the buyer. So we as a brokerage, Keller Williams Success, we could say to you as an agent, our company policy is you need to collect 3% on all your transactions. We can say that. We have not. We have not said that. We let you run your business the way that you want to run your business. But we could set commissions for our agents and say, this is our expectation, 3%. If you don't collect 3%, then we're going to charge you the difference between what you've collected and the 3%. There are some brokerages that do that. We don't. That's the only person that can establish commissions is the brokerage. Very few do. It's just dangerous legally to set commissions. It takes the free market out of it. Any questions on that?
No, that's great.
And then on the exclusive right to sell, very similar on here, except they reverse things on us again here too. So for you being a new agent, that's great because you're not accustomed to the old ways of filling this form out. But section 2 in the past was the total compensation for both the buyer's agent and the listing agent. Now section 2 is just the listing agent. So this amount right here is just what you're going to get paid. This is your commission, okay? Then we come down here to section 2.2, and this is the buyer's agent commission down here. Then the other thing that we added is we added an initial right below the compensation saying, hey, I understand that, okay? I'm initialing this saying that I understand the way that the commissions are paid, okay? Because in the past, we just had them initial at the bottom of the page. But now we're having them initial twice on here. And again, the date at the top in section 1 is the end date, not the start date. The start date is the date on the last page that you signed it. That's when it becomes effective, okay? And then they've added that same language that brokerage fees are not, they're fully negotiable. They're not set by law, by board, association, MLS, whatever. So they added that language in bold print. And it's always been that way. It's always been negotiable. This is not a change.
It's just an assurance.
Yeah. And then 2.3, it talks about compensation agreement between company and buyer's brokerage. In the event the company agrees in written compensation agreement to pay buyer's brokerage, seller agrees that the payment amount will be added to the brokerage fee referenced in 2.1. The company may not agree to a written compensation agreement that exceeds the authorized amount in section 2.2. So that's basically just saying what we talked about before is that you can't receive more than what your buyer broker agreement says you can receive. Okay. It's gotten to the point where some listing agents are actually saying to you as the buyer's agent, when you call and ask, hey, my buyer's interested in your property. What compensation are you offering? The listing agent is saying, send me your buyer broker agreement and we'll pay what your buyer broker agreement says. How do you feel about that as a buyer's agent?
Pressure just a little bit, but I mean, if I negotiate it high enough that I'm confident that I'll get my 4%, for example, I have no problem, but I'm showing all my cards. That's how I feel.
Yeah. So there's a lot of controversy around that. There's agents that feel like that's not the listing agent's business, that they're not entitled to see that agreement, which legally they're not. There's others that share your opinion as, hey, I have nothing to hide. You know, if I'm asking for a full commission, I don't mind showing that to them because then that validates my position to get paid a full commission, right?
But I assume at this point, because I'm just like planning my strategies and things that it varies from client to client. Like I have this expectation and you have, you know, how much work it will take, what type of client am I working with, all of that will come to terms.
Yeah. So my personal opinion is I would not share my buyer broker agreement with the listing agent. I would just say, look, I'm sorry. I don't feel comfortable doing that. Tell you what, I'm going to put what's on my buyer broker agreement in the rep sheet. And then you present that to the seller and let's see what the seller has to say about that. Because the thing that's a little troubling is that in that document, it has if they fill it out completely, it has the buyer's address, it has the buyer's cell phone number. So if the listing agent was unscrupulous, they could reach out to your buyer, has the expiration date that your agreement is expiring. So there's information on there that a dishonest listing agent could use against you if they chose to.
Yeah, I see.
So, so I think the better way is not to become confrontational about it or anything. Just say, you know what, I'm not comfortable doing that. I'm just going to put what's on my BBA in the rep sheet and you present that to the seller.
BBA
Buyer broker agreement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
I'm not legally binded to show my cards in this case. Okay, yeah, it's good to.
So this is an additional document that the state came up with. It's called the Real Estate Brokerage Payment Addendum. So this is the document that I told you existed before all of this came down with the NAR, where the buyer could ask the seller to pay their brokerage commission. So this form still exists. This is another way to ask for a compensation. I think this is best served though, in addition to what's listed in the rep sheet. So here's the scenario where I think this document would come into play. So you call the listing agent and say, hey, what's the compensation being offered? The listing agent says 3%. So then you write up the rep sheet with 3% in section 4.3 of the purchase contract, and you send it over to the seller. The listing agent sends you back a counter offer and says that the commission is only going to be 2%. And you're like, what? You told me it was going to be 3%. Well, 3% for a full price offer with no concessions and closing in 30 days and at least 20% down. I mean, they can make up a story, right? As to why the commission was changed from 3% to 2%. And they're okay to do that. I get it. That's why it's a little tricky when you're the listing agent and you're telling buyer's agents what the compensation is. Because if they send you a crappy offer, I got an offer yesterday on a brand new listing of mine. It had been listed for 12 hours. And this happens because these are guys that are going to flip houses. These are investors, and they always come in low, right? Because they need money to do the fix up and the profit and all that stuff. So the offer came in $99,000 low. Well, the seller's not even interested in taking a look at that, right? But that's kind of my case is that if the buyer sends you a crappy offer, is the seller going to reward them by paying a 3% commission? Probably not. So the commission can change based on the terms of the offer, because for the seller, it's the total package. What am I paying in commissions? What am I paying in concessions? And what am I getting as a purchase price? Those three buckets. And so that's how they look at it. And then those three buckets end up being the total financial picture for the property. So that's why that compensation could change. This document is the way for you to go back in a counter offer back to the seller and say, hey, we want 1% additional compensation in this transaction. And it's the buyer asking for it, not you, because you have a 3% BBA, buyer broker agreement. So the buyer is saying to the seller, hey, seller, we as the buyers want you to pay an additional 1% in commission. So this is how you do that with this document right here. Okay. Does that make sense? And that's in addition to any other compensation or offered. So you've got the 2% in the counter offer back from the seller, then you counter with 1 more percent. So if they accept this, then you've got your 3% compensation. And then this document has a little space here under section 2, and this is new, to put in additional terms. So you could also add additional terms in there, like, for example, say your buyer is willing to raise the purchase price a little bit to help offset some of the closing costs they're asking for, or to offset your commission. So let's say you want to raise the purchase price to $350,000. You could do it there under additional terms. So that's kind of a nice little place to kind of make some changes to the contract in addition to the commission, so that you don't have just one. So you just don't have this document that addresses commission, and then you'd have to do another addendum to address other issues. That allows you to put multiple issues on one document, so there's less paperwork. It's just an efficiency thing. That makes sense? So the real estate brokerage payment addendum is the addendum that you would use if you want to raise the commission that was offered in the REPC. Okay. Any questions so far? No. It's very clear. Okay. So this document is the one that we talked about initially. So this is the compensation agreement. So this is the one that the listing agent has the seller fill out at the time that they take the listing, if you choose to do your business that way. This is optional, but this is the way the Utah Association of Realtors told us to originally do this, was get your exclusive right to sell, your listing document filled out, and all of the documents that you need to list the property. And then you have them fill out this compensation agreement. And then you share that with the buyer's agents. So that's how they originally told us to do this. So this is that document that just says that the seller, as part of the listing documents, is offering this compensation, and that the condition of the payment is conditioned on a successful closing. So that money is not owed unless there is a closing. Okay. And then then 6 is a new section of this document that says arbitration and attorney's fees. Any dispute arising out of this agreement shall first be submitted to arbitration. So each board of realtors has an arbitration panel. So if you ever get into a dispute with another agent over a commission, the amount of a commission, if a commission is owed, the most common dispute is that you're working with a buyer, and for some reason the buyer wants to dump you and pick up another agent. Maybe the other agent's willing to do it for less compensation. They're a family member. Maybe they've offered them an enticement, which is illegal, but it happens all the time. Hey, work with me and I'll give you $1,000 at closing towards your closing costs, whatever the case may be. But if you have a signed buyer broker agreement with them, they can't do that unless you choose to cancel your buyer broker agreement. That's why sometimes arbitration happens, is because you have a signed buyer broker agreement with that person. The person wants to work with someone else. You won't cancel your buyer broker agreement, and they go work with this other agent and buy a house. Now they owe 2 commissions. They owe a commission to you, and they owe a commission to the new agent. So you have to go to either court or arbitration to figure out who's owed what. This document and the buyer broker agreement says we're going to arbitrate before we go to court. So then you submit a complaint to the Board of Realtors. The Board of Realtors sets a hearing, an arbitration hearing. And what that is that you go to the board and there's a panel of 5 of your peers. So 5 other realtors who have volunteered to be on this panel to hear grievances, and you go and you plead your case. It's just like going to court. You go plead your case if you're the one who filed the action. You're the plaintiff. So you go tell your side of the story. The other agent is there. They tell their side of the story. You're allowed to bring a broker if you want. So Sean, since he's the principal broker, he goes to those hearings unless he's out of town. And then you can also take an attorney with you if you choose to. It's kind of frowned on to take an attorney just because you're in front of your peers. And the purpose of the arbitration is to avoid legal. And if you take an attorney,
You bring in a gun.
yeah, you're bringing the shotgun to the thing. So yeah, so then each of you give a closing statement. And then within 5 days, the arbitration panel sends you a letter and says, here's what we've decided. And that's binding. And so if you get all of it, you get all of it. If they get all of it, they get all of it. Because very seldom they don't split the baby. It's not King Benjamin, okay, in the Bible where he said, okay, I'll split the baby because the 2 moms couldn't decide whose baby it was. And the real mom said, oh, let her have it. I don't want you to kill the baby. They don't split the baby. It's all or nothing, typically. So I've sat on those panels. I've been to those panels. Unfortunately, I've never seen them split the baby. Usually somebody has the procuring cause in the case. And so that's the person who ends up usually getting the commission. And then also on this one as well, there's additional terms. Like I said, it's signed by the selling agent, it's signed by the buyer's agent, the seller, and the buyer. So this is a legally binding document. And so that's why it holds up in court. All right. So this is a new form. And it is a form that basically, so it's an addendum to the exclusive buyer broker agreement. And the reason for this form is to say, hey, buyer, we're going to try to get the brokerage fee satisfied by a third party. In other words, we're not looking to you to pay the entire 3% or 2%, whatever the fee is that you have in your buyer broker agreement. We're going to attempt to have a third party pay it, which is a seller, which is traditionally the way that this transaction has gone. Now, in some cases, they won't pay the full commission. So this is just informing them, look, we're going to try to get the third party to pay it. In the event that they don't pay it, we're going to look to you to pay the difference. That's what this document says. Now, your business strategy, whatever your business strategy is, you can choose, hey, Dalton, good morning. Good morning. You can choose to waive the additional amount. So let's say that your buyer broker agreement says 3%, okay? This says you're gonna get a third party to pay it. The third party says they'll pay 2.5. So that's what they've agreed to in the rev sheet. Or in the compensation agreement is 2.5. Now, this document says they're left with that 0.5% because the third party didn't pay all of the compensation. Now, your business strategy needs to be one of two things. You either hold the buyer to the 0.5%, and that gets added to their closing costs as a cost of doing the transaction, or you can waive that. You can say to them, hey, you know, I don't want you guys to have to come up with another $2,000 in closing. I'm going to do an addendum to our buyer broker agreement that says that I'm willing to accept 2.5%. And then you don't have to come out of pocket. So that's your business decision if you want to do it that way. But this is what that document allows you to do is it says, hey, we're going to try to get that from a third party. If we can't, then we're going to look to you to pay the difference. It doesn't say that you can waive that if you choose to, but you always have that in your back pocket. Now, here's a word of advice. Don't waive that until you're well under contract on a particular property and you've gone beyond your inspections, you've gone beyond the appraisal, because there's always stuff that come up that are going to cause you additional work, like inspection items, or let's say the appraisal comes in $5,000 short. Now your buyer has to come up with another $5,000 to make the deal, because the lender is going in a loan up to the appraisal amount. So now they got to bridge that gap, that $5,000 gap with the appraisal. Wouldn't it be awesome if you were the hero and said, hey, you know what? I'm sorry that happened. I'm going to reduce my commission to 2.5%, which is going to save you $2,000 once you apply that towards the difference. You're a hero because you just solved half their problem. That's how I would do it. Don't do it early because once you do it, and let's say that deal falls apart, now you got to go find another house and start the process all over again, which is more work. Maybe they're offering a 3% commission. So you lowered it to 2.5. Can you go back up to 3? Pretty tough. Pretty tough to go back up to 3. So wait until you are under contract on a particular property. You've done your inspection, you got the appraisal back, and then that's going to be a pleasant surprise to the buyer to get that discount. That's how I do it, because I don't want to give it away early and then regret that they did. Does that make sense? So this you don't need to worry about this. This was an addendum that we used to amend the exclusive right to sell before the new exclusive right to sell came out. The new exclusive right to sell and the newer buyer broker agreement all have this language in them. So this document no longer exists, but the change on the exclusive right to sell and the buyer broker agreement is just like I pointed out. We break the commission out separately. Before, on the old agreement, it was just 6%, and then it was understood that then you would have to say how much of that 6% went to the buyer's brokerage. In this case, they're separate. So this is your fee as the listing agent. This is what you're going to pay the buyer's agent. So it's separate. And then it has the language that says they're fully negotiable. No one fixes or sets commissions. That has that whole disclosure language in it. And so that's all now incorporated in the new documents. So that is pretty much the documents and what I consider best practices. We consider best practices when it comes to this. you have any questions about that?
Not really right now, but
Yeah.
I presume I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Filling out my paper.
Once you start, filling it out, I'm sure questions will pop up. The biggest question is, how much, so you're in a great place in your business in that you have knowledge that 99.9% of our agents don't have because of your education. And so you've got a definite advantage over a lot of agents, I believe, because of that training that you've gone through. And so just come up with your business plan. What is your business going to look like? What is your niche? What niche are you going after? Is it your neighborhood? Are you going to farm your neighborhood? Are you going to farm a previous neighborhood? Are you going after particular kinds of properties, short sales, foreclosures, for sale by owners? Where are you going to focus your time in your energy? Time is money in this business. Time is our commodity. Two things are our commodity: time and our education. We already covered education. You have an amazing education in the business, and time. So time you spend working with people who are wasting your time is costing you money. So you have to be very prudent with your time. The beauty of this business, in my opinion, is you get to choose who you work with, both as clients and as a brokerage. You want to surround yourself with people who support you, care for you, have your best interest in mind, are available to support you and help you in your business. And then it's up to you to determine where you're going to spend your time and what are you going to charge for your time. And starting out, very honestly, when I started out, a lot of agents do. They feel like they have to discount a little bit in order to give the client an advantage. That's up to you. Whatever your business strategy is to get you started in the business. If I were you, I would recommend that a good way to get started in the business is to do open houses for agents who have listings. Because what that does is that exposes you to buyers. Every buyer that comes in that is not being represented by an agent is fair game. So on a Saturday, you could have 10 people come to your open house. 5 or 6 of those are not working with agents. You just had 5 or 6 opportunities to pick that person up as a potential buyer. The other thing is that you get to have conversations and practice your conversations with people in a fairly relaxed environment in an open house. And so we have agents here in our office, and I'll point them out to you here on the capper wall. So capper wall is an agent who has capped. So they've paid the company their $18,000 for their fees, and now they're keeping all of their money for the rest of the year, which means they're probably at a minimum, they're in 6 figures, 100, 150K. The guy that just walked by, that's how he became a capper, was doing open houses for people. This guy here, same thing, open houses for cappers. She was doing open houses, and now she's got I think last year she did 350,000. These other 2 guys are probably fairly similar. She's another one, Anna Buckley, open houses for other agents and making 6 figures. So that's a really fast way to accelerate your business, because every Saturday you do an open house for a different agent, or you find an agent who has a lot of listings. They need people helping with open houses. And you just hook up with them. You need to say, hey, I'm available these Saturdays this month. I'm happy to do open houses for you, and establish a relationship with maybe 1 or 2 agents, about doing open houses.
Is that probably that's the best day
to do open houses and probably Sundays,
Saturday, Sunday, Friday afternoon,
right after.
Friday afternoon. So,
Saturday will be priority and then Friday afternoon. maybe
yeah,
Sunday.
I've never done an open house on a Sunday, but that's just my own personal religious preference.
Yeah.
But agents in the office that do open houses on Sundays say that the Mormons are actually the ones that come to their open house because they come out of church. They're all loaded up in the minivan and they drive through a neighborhood and there's an open house. Oh, well, let's stop in and see. Because it's not shopping, they're not buying anything that day,
Yeah,
because our religion says.
Saturdays are pretty busy for our families.
Yeah,
We gotta do all the groceries.
yeah,
Sunday's more relaxed. I can see that.
yeah. So they say Sundays are actually a good day. I've never done it.
But I've been thinking that maybe Sunday for my family dynamic might work to just bring the whole family and help me host an open house. things
Yeah,
like
you'd
that.
want to get permission from the
Yeah.
agent you're hosting for and from the seller,
If that's.
if that's okay. My guess is some people would frown on that just because it might distract you. And it might end up being a little messy depending on how old your kids are and how many kids you have. But
That's a good point.
I would suggest open houses. Now, having said that, an agent that is a high producing agent is going to require that you do your open houses according to
There's standards.
the Keller Williams standards. So we're very unusual as a company to have developed a program around open houses. The brokerage I came to from Century 21 Everest, they actually said you're stupid if you do open houses. They're a waste of time. The only reason why you would do an open house is if your seller asked you to. In other words, to satisfy your seller. The sellers do expect generally, if they know much about real estate, they do expect to do open houses. Because in their mind, it's a tool for selling the house. And people don't have to make an appointment. They can leave for 2 or 3 hours. They can go do a fun family activity and then come back and you've had 10 buyers come through the house. Whereas if you didn't do open houses, then that would be 10 individual appointments that they have to prepare for and leave the house for and come back and clean. So for a seller, it's an efficient way to get buyers through their house. So they really like it. So it's really interesting how different companies have different philosophies on open houses.
How does it work? And that's fantastic. How does it work to host an open house where the listing is somewhere else? Like, I'm just thinking about a house that is in my neighborhood, or it's listed by homie.
So you can only do open houses for houses that are listed by Keller Williams
Right.
Success.
Gotcha.
This particular brokerage.
That's how we.
Yeah,
Okay.
because the listing agreement says that the broker has the right to substitute agents as needed to service the listing. So if the listing agent says, hey, I'm not available to do an open house Saturday, will you do it for me? That's a substitution. So we're authorized to do those substitutions. Now, the listing agent should let the seller know, hey, I've got an agent who's going to hold the open house for me on Saturday. This is the person's name, that kind of thing, just so they know who's holding the open house for them. The other question you need to ask is, what's the compensation? What's the circumstances around me holding the open house for you? If I pick up a buyer, are you expecting me to pay you a referral fee?
Mhm.
Or is the buyer mine completely? I don't owe you anything. And it varies. Some agents will say, yeah, I want a 20% referral fee on buyers if you end up selling a house because you did an open house for me. Others say, no, I appreciate you just doing the open house. So whatever you get, you keep. So you need to work that out. You need to work out the compensation before you do the open house. So it's clear as to what the financial component of the open house is. The other thing is that this NAR law now says that you can't show a house without having a signed buyer broker agreement with that buyer. Can't unlock the door unless you have a signed buyer broker agreement. Unless it's your own listing or you've been substituted on the listing. So if you sit an open house for one of our agents, you don't need a buyer broker agreement for every person that walks through that door. Because we have a listing agreement. Now, where does the buyer broker agreement come into play? Comes into play if you end up working. If you show them a house other than that one that you're sitting, that's when the buyer broker agreement comes into play.
Fantastic.
So what I would do if I were you, I would ask an agent that has open houses coming up for our brokerage. And the way that you find that out is you go on the MLS, put in our brokerage down at the very bottom. It says listing brokerage, put in Keller Williams Success, and then hit the open house button. And it'll show you all of the open houses that are scheduled for our brokerage. And then you can see which ones are close to you, which ones are in a price range that you want to work. You might have a particular price range that you want to work in. And then who's the agent? And then just contact some agents and ask them if they'd like help with open houses. Some of them use a lot of different agents to do their open houses. Some have one or two particular agents that they prefer to use for their open houses. Very honestly, some agents do a much better job at open houses than others. If I were you, I would ask an agent by the name of Chris Salyers if you could shadow him at one of his next open houses. He does right here. He's an ex police captain, retired police captain from Alaska. Been in the business a couple of years, and that's how he built his business too. His open houses, exclusively does open houses. But does a great job. He follows the Keller Williams program to a T. And before you leave, why don't you ask Lauren up front for the playbook? So we have what's called playbooks for open houses, for different things. So we have a playbook that is a step-by-step instruction book on how to do an open house.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not easy. It's very intense. It has you go knock the neighborhood in advance of the open house.